Okay, we're recording. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Just a brief overview, and then I'll turn things over to Mrs. Malone, the building principal at Heritage Middle School. My name is Troy Whalen. I'm the superintendent of District 104 here in Summit, Bedford Park, and Bridgeview Gardens. On February 1st, I presented a hybrid learning plan to our school board, and that included in-person learning schedules for pre-kindergarten through fifth grade students. We did not include middle school students at the time, as we wanted to phase in our hybrid learning schedule, focusing on our youngest learners first. And we also needed some additional time to sort out some of the available hybrid schedules that were available to the middle school learners. Last week, we hosted a town hall meeting for our kindergarten through fifth grade parents, and that was followed by an election survey in which parents had to choose between hybrid learning or remote learning. As of about 4:30 this afternoon, we have received about 826 responses, about 83% of the 1,000 that we expect by the end of the week. So far, roughly 26%, or about 219 of our parents have elected to send their students back for hybrid learning. So 219 students for the third trimester. This evening offers you an opportunity to hear from Mrs. Malone and her team regarding a couple of options that we will be exploring down the road for hybrid learning, how that would impact your students. But most importantly, it's going to give you an opportunity to ask questions that are on your mind and give us an opportunity to answer those questions this evening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mrs. Malone and her team, and we'll have a question and answers period at the very end of the slide presentation.
All right. Thanks so much, Dr. Whalen. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us tonight for our town hall meeting for Heritage Middle School. I did want to do a couple of announcements. I guess we can go to that next slide, Dr. Whalen. A couple of introductions. So we have Dr. Whalen. He did introduce himself already. I'm Mrs. Malone, principal at HMS, and I'm going to introduce a few extra people if you guys could wave when I call your name. We have Mrs. Skronik, our assistant principal. Mr. Foreman, our dean and athletic director. We have Mrs. Mansky, one of our HMS math teachers. And Mrs. Traficant, another HMS math teacher. So guys, as we are going through the presentation, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, and our teacher representatives and staff will be able to answer those questions, and we'll also be able to answer your questions at the end. Okay, we're ready to go. So tonight's agenda, we're going to talk about a few different things. The bulk of it will be that middle school model. So what does it mean once your student makes it over to Heritage Middle School? We'll also talk about our current HMS schedule. We'll look at a couple of sample middle school hybrid schedules, and then we'll save some time for questions and answers. At the end of our presentation, you guys will be invited to complete a survey just for us to gauge interest in our parents' desire to have their kids come back in a hybrid fashion to HMS. Okay. So the middle school model. When your kids make it over to middle school, you notice that once they leave the fifth grade center, they have more than one teacher. And that's for one specific reason. The middle school model, it's centered around subject-centered teaching with content specialists. So that means your sixth grader's math teacher specializes in math. So that teacher took extra courses, went through a special course of study in order to teach math. So each content specialist specializes in their subject. So it's quite possible that my seventh grade ELA teacher can only teach ELA. They're not endorsed, or they haven't specialized in any other subjects. So this is why your student, and it's a great benefit to them because these teachers are really masters in their subject. So their core subjects, that ELA, math, science, and social studies, are taught by those core content teachers. At HMS, we do have our 6 periods. So we have our 4 content periods, and then we also have a PE or health and an elective. So that's why, that's one of the main changes once your student sort of transitions over to the middle school, why they don't have just one teacher anymore teaching all of that content throughout the day. Ready for the next slide. So here's an example, actually not even an example. This is our current HMS remote learning schedule. So our students start and end their day in their homeroom/advisory class. So that's that same teacher they have to start their day with, and they end their day with that teacher. And that teacher gives them their announcements, any important information that's happening throughout the day. That's sort of that bond that they get with their homeroom, that core group of students. Then they have their 4 content classes, an elective, and a PE or health. Okay. And so here is one example. So keep in mind, this is not an example of a hybrid schedule that HMS is necessarily going to adopt. This is just an example of a middle school hybrid schedule. So we could have 2 groups of students. We could have our group A students and our group B students. Our group A students would come in each day from 7:50 to 10:20, and then they would go home and complete the rest of their schedule remotely. So they would come in for homeroom in their first 3 periods. Then they'd have that break in time. They'd finish up periods 4, 5, and 6 at home remotely. Then our group B students would sort of do the same thing, but flipped. So they would start remotely at home for their morning homeroom and periods 1, 2, and 3. And then they would arrive to the building at 12:20 for in-person learning. So one really key component here is that this would require us to have 2 bus pickups and drop-offs. And so that's not something we really know if we have the capacity for at this time, but this is just an example of what a hybrid model could look like. And then we have a second example. Okay, so here is another example of a middle school hybrid model. So we still have those 2 groups. We have a group A and a group B. So group A would come in from 7:50 until 10:20 on Mondays and Tuesdays. So that's just that first half of their day. And then they'd go home and finish their remaining classes remotely from home. Then group B would come in on Thursdays and Fridays for would start with remote learning on Thursdays and Fridays, and then have their in-person later in the day. Now, on Wednesdays, everyone would be remote. So we'd use that Wednesday for deep cleaning. So every student would be remote on that day. And every student would be remote in the PM. So they'd come in for half the day. And we can come back to this if you guys want after we're done. Okay, we're ready for the next slide. So how this could look if we implemented something similar at HMS. So in addition to following all IDPH guidelines, like wearing our masks, social distancing, washing our hands, all of those things, your child would have to complete a daily COVID screening to make sure that they are not exhibiting any symptoms of COVID. Once they arrive to the building, they would line up outside, and we already have the markings at the school. So we have the 6-foot markings prepared for the students already. So they would line up outside, and then they'd be walked in by a member of our staff. Our students would also be assigned to 1 classroom for the day. So this is really important. So ordinarily, our students would switch classes. So the bell would ring, they get up and they go to their next class. In this situation, or any hybrid situation at the middle school, your student would come and they would sit in that class for the day. And they're going to participate in the same lesson as their remote peers. They'd be using their school issued Chromebook. So they would not be able to switch classes. They'd just be assigned there. They'd be doing the same work at the same time. So they're not necessarily being afforded any additional teaching. They're just pretty much remote learning just within the walls of HMS. And the teacher would be teaching those students and her remote students simultaneously. And then we do have some students, without necessarily implementing a hybrid model, we do plan to invite some of our students into the building who've had some difficulties engaging in remote learning for various reasons. Some of our students need a quiet space to work. And so we do have, plans to invite students back into the building, not necessarily as a hybrid option, but just as a means to so that they have a place to sit and learn. And I think we can go to that next slide. So yeah, so that's pretty much it. So shortly after this meeting, and actually after, we're going to do the same presentation again in Spanish right after this one. So shortly after this one, a link is going to be shared. So I'm going to send you guys a text blast with a survey. And that survey is pretty much asking you, so given the information that we've shared, would you be interested in sending your kid, your student, to HMS in a hybrid fashion? Would that be an interest to you? We're not necessarily picking whether or not you're going to come or picking one of those two options, but just is that something that would interest you? And it's going to ask you things about busing and engagement and things of that sort. So that survey is going to be blasted out to you guys after the second presentation. And there'll also be a link to the survey on the district website. So that, and that's it for now. I saw a couple of questions in the chat. But if you guys have any questions, we can answer any questions you guys might have now. I did see one question that said, so is the social aspect the benefit of being in person? Unfortunately, it will not necessarily be the benefit because our students will not be able to engage in those same social components of school as they would before. Like there won't be a lunch, deal. They won't be switching classes. They won't have lockers. So, not to make it seem awful, but there really won't be a social component associated with being in the building. They're literally just coming with their Chromebook and they're going to learn in the school as opposed to at home.
So there's a question in the chat about what the advantage is to going to the building. So there are some parents that have raised concerns that, their children need, a quiet environment and a safe space for them to do the learning in. So HMS would be able to, if we put that plan in place, would be able to house those students to give them the quiet environment free of distractions from within the home. That would be the advantage. And then as Ms. Malone already mentioned, in terms of the social aspect, I can speak because my kids are currently hybrid. They're not allowed to socialize with their peers per se because they have to maintain that 6 feet of social distancing as well.
One of the questions that I've received over the past few weeks is why we're only doing a 3-hour block or a 2.5-hour block, and why is it half day or every other day? And that really falls to our capacity as a school district to house students and maintain 6 feet of social distancing. So we've removed all non-essential furniture from our classrooms and have left about 10 to 13 desks per room, depending on the size of the room. And that is the maximum number of students that we can accommodate at any given time. Both the CDC and the Illinois Department of Public Health require us to follow the 6 feet of social distancing as much as possible, especially in the classroom. And so that's one of the reasons. And the other is that we do not want students putting themselves or others at risk by eating meals on campus at this time. And so the shortened schedule will allow them to receive their meal for the day, as well as the next day's breakfast, and take that home with them to consume, and then be ready for their after school or after noon learning lessons.
I did see a question regarding remote. So yes, there is still an option to remain 100% remote with your student. It's still an option. Well, I have a question about graduation. So yes, we are getting very creative with graduation. We are moving slowly with making definite plans. What we do have in that letter that went home is a date, May 26th. We are going to have some sort of a ceremony for the students, but we have to stay within those IDPH guidelines. So as soon as we're able to sort of move forward, we'll definitely get that information out to you. We will be able to do graduation pictures. We've gotten our cap and gown measurement situation together, so you'll get more information in a letter soon.
There was a question in the chat about how the daily COVID screenings were going to take place. And then I had just mentioned, you know, that should the students return to the building, we talked about the badges for the elementary students. So that's something that we will talk about should this plan take place.
Dr. Whalen, did you want to mention, talk about the daily COVID screenings?
Absolutely. So we are currently looking at a product that'll be in place the next couple of weeks that will help us streamline the process of screening at home. It does fall to the parent's responsibility to check their child or children for COVID-like symptoms. You would receive your two options. You could either receive a daily email that would have a link that would take you to the screening question. And when you submit that, that tells us whether or not your child has been cleared for the day or is going to need to be held at home for the day. There's also an app that you could download and do the same thing, essentially on a daily basis. Just run through all the COVID symptoms that are listed, indicate whether or not your child or children have any of those symptoms. If not, they will receive, on our end, we'll see them as a green screen. We'll have a green screen, and that will indicate that they are clear to come into the building. Every student that attends will be given a second temperature check prior to entering the building. And any student who has a temperature greater than 100.4 degrees will be asked to go to our CARES room, and we will contact parents and ask them to come pick up the student and have them tested or quarantined. So that's another important thing to note. The Illinois Department of Public Health does require that any child exhibiting symptoms must either be tested or must quarantine for between 10 and 14 days. And during that time, they would be placed back on remote learning.
So Dr. Whalen, we have another question. What's the process if a student tests positive after attending school?
So we are required to contact trace. And so our nurses will have class lists, and they will go through each student's day, any student that tests positive, and track down whether or not who they came in contact with. And if they were considered a close contact, which means a close contact by definition is anyone who is within 6 feet of that individual that tested positive for more than 15 minutes during the course of the day. So then those students would also receive a notice. Any siblings of the student who tested positive would also be asked to quarantine at home. And while all students are in quarantine, they would be remote learning 100% of the time.
I did see a question about 7th graders being allowed to take the math placement test. So Argo High School just completed scheduling for our graduating 8th graders. So they should be reaching out about our 7th grade placement test soon. Trying to go up and make sure I didn't miss anyone.
I see a question. Will students be given the option to stay home completely? Yes, the remote learning option will stay in place. About 74% of our K-5 parents are electing to stay remote at this time. So that option will stay in place for the remainder of the school year.
So there's a question in the chat about the timeline for possibly going back to school.
So we, in the recommendation that we put forth to the board in early February, there were two key indicators. The first being that the community positivity rate over a 14 rolling day average would be less than 8%. The Illinois Department of Public Health considers anything above 8% to be a substantial risk and advises districts to stay in remote learning under those conditions. So that was the first parameter that was established, that that rate needs to be below 8%. Currently, it is just slightly below. I believe today's rate was 7.45. The second is adequate staffing. And this one, it definitely has an impact on our ability to provide hybrid learning, because we need to have teachers working with students in those in-person settings. And if a teacher is unable to attend due to childcare issues of their own because their children are remote learning, or if they have a heightened risk due to a health condition, or if they live with a family member who has a heightened risk of COVID due to a health condition, they may not be able to come into the building on a daily basis, and they would be teaching remotely into the classroom. So having an adequate number of staff is also very critical for our being able to offer a hybrid plan. So those two factors are major variables in our planning to determine when we could possibly open. March 3rd for kindergarten, pre-kindergarten through 5th grade learners was selected because it's the beginning of the next trimester. Again, dependent upon the interest level of our middle school parents, we would be exploring how we would phase that in at a slightly later date.
I think we got all of the questions in the chat. Did anyone else have any other questions? Well, I really do thank you guys for coming out and for getting this information. And I hope it helps you guys a little bit to, make your decision and in understanding how this middle school is rolling with all the different teachers and all the different courses. As always, give us a call. I try to include my email on everything, but I'm pmalone@sd104.us, and I'll put it in the chat, or if Trev or Natalie, if you guys can put it in the chat. You can always email or call the school if you have any questions at all. Look out for that survey that'll probably come out at about 8 to let us know your interest in our hybrid options. Again, thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Stay warm.
Yes, stay warm. Thank you for joining us this evening.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.